everything goes swimmingly until somebody loses an eye. And I just wanted to flash at you some of these headlines. These are recent headlines. Securities regulators crack down on crypto fraud. Low on trust, high on volatility. Can Bitcoin exist beyond dubious transactions? So that got me thinking. If trust remains an issue in precisely the things which was supposed to solve the problem of trust, what's a person supposed to do? And digging around, I found out that there are people who worry about this kind of thing. So our next speaker, Charlene Cieslik, have I got that right, Charlene? Great. Okay, I've got to read you her title. Charlene is the Chief Anti-Money Laundering Officer of Coinsquare, Canada's most secure digital asset exchange for buying Bitcoin, Ethereum, and other digital currencies. She has held the role of Chief Compliance Officer, Chief Anti-Money Laundering Officer, Chief Anti-Bribery Officer, and Chief Privacy Officer at several Canadian and foreign scheduled banks, where she was responsible for the development, remediation, and execution of AML/ATF anti-bribery, regulatory, and privacy programs. Charlene.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for that introduction.
But are you some kind of cop? Is that what it is?
Well, no. I used to be a parole officer back in the day when I first graduated from University of Toronto with a master's in criminology, and I thought, I want to work in anti-crime, but I don't want to be in prison all day. So I thought, where's the next best place to go? White-collar crime.
Bay Street.
Well, on that introduction, it's hard to know where to start, but my PR guy made me put this slide up here, and I think Moses did a great job of giving a summary of who I am and what I've done so far. So I think I could probably skip over that. But I do, all of my experience in working with these scheduled banks, and I started even in smaller currency exchange businesses, credit unions. I even worked for a fintech company out of Newfoundland, and then did a Big Four consulting firm work and big banks both here and in the US and across the world. And I think that all really suited me to go into this space in anti-money laundering in the cryptocurrency space. So I am now the Chief Anti-Money Laundering Officer of Coinsquare, and we like to consider ourselves Canada's most secure platform for the purchase of these digital currencies. And since 2014, the company's inception, they've never lost a coin. And I think that's a testament to sort of Coinsquare's decision to act as though they were regulated before they were even regulated. And I think our previous speakers set me up quite well in talking about seemingly mostly the bad part about Bitcoin and other digital currencies. You know, as I said, Coinsquare's been behaving as though it's been regulated like a financial institution for some time. But if we look at the history of how long it took for banks to be regulated, back in the early days, financial institutions were really pillared off. They called it the four-pillar system. So there was banks, insurance companies, trusts, and securities, and they were all very separate and not allowed to sort of act in each other's spaces. And it took us all this time to get to a place where Canada opened up a bit more to foreign ownership and foreign involvement of banking in Canada. And around the 90s or so, anti-money laundering became a concern with globalization and the advent of the internet and the ability and the ease to move money across borders, as one of my previous speaking companions here mentioned. And then when 9/11 occurred, of course, it certainly solidified the concern about the global movement of money and how banks and governments wanted to control that and try to mitigate the risks of money laundering and terrorist financing. But if we look at the crypto space, within the last year alone, there's been a heavy amount of movement, and compared to the prior, advent of regulation in banking, it moved quite slow in comparison. Canada was one of the first countries as early as 2014 to mention virtual currency in its anti-money laundering regulations, defining it like a money service business. And just 2 weeks ago, they finally released, thankfully for me, the draft regulations that are very crypto-specific. And those are kind of rules that are specific to these coin sales that we're seeing, Bitcoin, Ethereum, et cetera. But now our Canadian Securities Agency has weighed in by offering notices on coin and token offerings, again, like some of my some of the previous speakers had mentioned, and also recently released some rules around the applications of security-specific laws around ICOs and ITOs. But, sorry, I'm having a clicking issue here. Why the concern, though? What's the concern with money laundering? I probably want to define that a little bit for you. When there is a crime that generates money, that money needs to be put into the financial system in order to be used. And previously, again, in the traditional financial space, concerns were increased as money became more global. Crime generates money, criminals want that money, but they don't want the attention that that money will bring. So they're looking for new ways to move it around, and I think cryptocurrency is a little bit of the old wine in new bottles, we like to say, where it's just a new method to further obscure the ownership of funds that might have been criminally generated. So in the global landscape, though, despite all of these risks, banks around the world are looking at issuing these central bank digital currencies that were previously talked about. Even with the risk, they're looking at ways to sort of bring it out of the shadows by tagging it to a currency or removing some of the anonymity that comes along with these cryptocurrencies. And to the point that in the global landscape, the G20 in Argentina recently came out and said they're looking at all their member countries to issue common sense regulations that take into account these risks but don't stifle innovation. And they want this done before July of this year. So I think there is a lot of confusion out there in the regulatory space. I'm going to argue that it's not completely unregulated because people have been already moving forward with this. And certainly I know at CoinSquare, we're trying to be ahead of the curve in anticipating where these rules will go. The problem is there is so many different definitions of cryptocurrency out there. In the US alone, there's 4 different definitions. Is it a commodity? Is it a currency? Is it property? Is it a security? Is it an alternative asset? Canada and Australia have determined to regulate cryptocurrency offerings like their money service businesses or currency exchanges, whereas countries like Japan are looking at it like a financial institution, like a bank. And some other places are just looking at it as a method of payment and aren't really defining it the same way. And I think all of that leaves people in my position certainly with some confusion. So what's Canada to do? I think I already mentioned that Canada was ahead of the curve on bringing virtual currency under the definition, and they've just solidified this with the drafts that are out right now that we're reading with great interest. But those drafts have some challenges in them as well. We are ahead of the G20 in bringing this into law in Canada, and I'm personally happy to hear that. But there are regulatory challenges that leave me scratching my head sometimes. We don't want regulation to stifle this innovation. I think, again, my previous speaking companions brought up some great points about the use cases for blockchain and for these digital currencies. And if regulators are late to the game, like some of them may be, some may accuse them of being, then it leaves us in a bad position. Some regulatory agencies have gone too far and have pushed people away, like the Kraken Exchange in New York told the New York Attorney General he refused to answer any further questions about what his business is doing and found it, I think one of the insulting was the word that he used with the question. So I'm looking for some communication with our regulators and working with the Department of Finance and working with global agencies to ensure that, these conversations continue with people like ourselves, people like CoinSquare, other people in the space that can be influencers. Because what's coming up is, that the global governing body of the United Nations, the Financial Action Task Force, is coming out with, in the next year, globally, standing rules that all countries who are members of the UN must follow. So I think regulators need to consider a few things here. These are unique investments, they are unique instruments, and they carry specific risks. And you gotta be cognizant of where are the rules being broken around the world if everybody has a different definition. It can rival a government currency, which is, I think, why there's some of that fear and some of that concern. But I think the risks with money laundering or terrorist financing are similar to cash when it comes to anonymity and security and consumer protections. But make no mistake about it, where there is money, there will be bad actors. But my position really is we need to mitigate the risk, allow the innovation, but we'll never completely remove the risk. And we're looking forward to working on how that's going to look in the future for Canada and regulation. Thank you. Can I stay up here?
So, Charlene, let's say you dig around and you uncover something unsavory.
Sure.
How do you go after the bad guys? Do you go after the bad
Well,
guys?
I wish they'd give me a badge and a gun and allow me to do these things, but I don't have the same powers as a law enforcement officer. But I feel our governments are putting the responsibilities on people like myself as chief anti-money laundering officers to do that work, but without the skills and the tools that are needed. Like, we don't have access to criminal records databases. We don't know what investigations are currently going on. So we have the same tools as everybody else. It's called the internet. And all we get to do is Google. That's my crystal ball for now. And when we do find something, we report it to the government and just hope that they do something about it.
Aha. And are they responsive? Right. Because this has been my question all along, is this system is portrayed as point-to-point and therefore secure, and everyone can see. But what happens if the guy at the other end refuses to comply, doesn't deliver the money? If the guy at the other end is a, I don't know, cartel overlord, how are you going to convince him to pay up?
Well, this is why I always say it's not that different than our current financial instruments when it comes to these kinds of risk. Because if you give someone $100 million in a suitcase and he goes away and he's supposed to do something criminal for you, but he doesn't, you've just lost that $100,000 in that bag too. So with virtual currency, I think old wine, new bottles. Okay.
Fascinating. Fascinating. Who knew?
Thank you again.
Thank you, Shirley.
Hold on. And I say, I go
Yeah.